On this show, I focus every episode on how to create a great leadership team. But what I want to do a little differently today is to focus a level down from that. One of the best ways to create a great leadership team is to make sure that you're taking care of those mid-level leaders. Your mid-level leaders, your middle managers, if you want to call them that, and I'd rather call them mid-level leaders, those folks are the lifeline of your organization. Without them doing their job at the highest level, you can't do your job at the highest level. They are the connectors between the strategy you work on as a senior leader and frontline execution. Strengthening mid-level leaders strengthens the entire organization. In fact, I would say that if they're weak, everyone in the company, including you, is doing the job of someone one level below them. Now, what do I mean by that? And I was just having a conversation with a client last week on this. Very specifically in this scenario, there was a vice president of service who couldn't do the job as vice president of service because his directors, the 4 directors that worked for him, were not really doing their job. The reason they weren't doing their job is because the customer service team members weren't doing their job. So picture this, is that if the frontline individuals aren't doing their job, and then you've got the folks that are supervising them. Well, the folks that are supervising them, as opposed to doing what they're supposed to do, they have to actually jump in and do the job of the customer service team members. And if they're jumping in and doing the job of the customer service team members, if the directors are doing the job of the customer service team members, well, who's doing the job of the director? The VP of service has to do that. So who's doing the job of the VP of service? Nobody. Or the CEO needs to jump in, and that's not going to work for very long. But if those directors are doing their job, coaching and mentoring the team members so they do their job, it impacts the whole company in a positive way. Now, in addition to productivity measures that are impacted, those mid-level leaders influence culture as much or more sometimes than the senior leaders do. They tend to see more of the organization from day to day. They're working with the rank and file employees. And as a senior leader, you may not be every day, depending on the size of your company. Now, the CEO or the senior leadership team could get up in front of everybody and talk about how important culture is. But the way your individual team members know you're serious is by how your mid-level leaders act. And if your mid-level leaders are not acting in a way that's consistent with your culture, consistent with your core values, those team members just start to believe it's all BS. Now, the mid-level leaders are also in a unique position because unlike senior leaders, unlike a CEO, unlike rank and file team members, those mid-level leaders need to manage both up and down. Of course, they need to lead and manage their direct reports. But they also need to manage up, communicate up, sometimes even lead up. And that puts them in a very difficult position of feeling like they've got to take one side or the other? Are they taking the side of their team members and looking like they're protecting them in the eyes of senior leaders, which can make them look weak? Or are they consistently taking the side of senior leaders and their team members believe they don't really have their backs? The mid-level leader position is a really difficult position. And on top of it just being a difficult position, there are a number of challenges they face when that mid-level leader position is not focused on in the right way. And I see time and time again, mid-level leaders became mid-level leaders because they were really good at what they did. They were really good salespeople, so they became a sales manager, or they were really good, on the factory floor, so they became a operations manager. And not only does being good at the day-to-day not always mean you could be great at leading and managing people. That's true, but let's even put that aside. What I see time and time again in small and mid-sized companies, the larger companies might do a little better job of this because they have the manpower and the dollars to put behind it. And they have so many mid-level leaders that they put formal programs in place. But at the small and mid-sized company level, these folks get promoted to those positions without any real training, coaching, or mentoring. They're left to navigate their new leadership responsibilities without a guide or a compass on how to do that. They also, more so than any other part of the organization, they need to balance the strategic nature of the business along with the operational demands of the business. And that's really hard to do. It's really hard to focus on strategy and vision when you're dealing with the, production line that broke down today, or you're dealing with the client that's complaining. You tend to dive in and roll up your sleeves as a mid-level leader into the details, but at the same time, you've got to keep strategy and vision in mind. So it's a very difficult position. And if your company is not growing significantly, it's also a position where people, really talented mid-level leaders, could feel stuck without opportunities for any upward mobility. And unless you have some kind of program in place or you're doing a good job coaching them, and we'll talk about all that, they're stuck without opportunities for upward mobility, but they're also stuck without any opportunities for skill building because they're so busy rolling up their sleeves and diving in to the day-to-day. So I want to talk about some ways, 8 ways, to develop mid-level leaders. And the first is not specific to mid-level leaders, but it's super important. Number one is to set crystal clear expectations for those leaders. Crystal clear expectations on what productivity you expect from their team, what it means to be a culture fit, how they and their team need to live core values. But on top of that, those are expectations you need to set with everyone, team members, mid-level leaders, senior leaders, and the CEO. Those expectations need to be there for everyone. But with mid-level leaders, especially those that are new to leadership, you need to set specific expectations for what it means to be a leader, what they should be doing to hold their people accountable, to give their people feedback, to coach them, develop them, retain them. So setting those expectations is key. That's number one, and it's got to start there. Number two is you've got to model the way. You can't expect your mid-level leaders to be better leaders than you if you're a senior leader. And I've seen in the past CEOs and VPs of HR say, we need our mid-level leaders to be stronger. We need stronger middle management. And they bring people in to do these leadership development programs, these trainers to come in and do leadership development programs. They do them for the middle managers. And yet the senior leaders aren't doing that stuff. So the middle managers learn things that aren't reinforced. And all that money and all that time goes to waste. So you've got to model the way as a leader. If you want your folks to coach and hold people accountable and give people feedback and have the difficult discussions and hire in the right way and coach people out of the organization, and if that's what's important, to have one-on-ones in the right way, you need to model the way and do that as a senior leader. It's got to start there because they will follow you. That's number 2, is modeling the way. Number 3 is start with your high performing team members, and even more specifically, those high potential folks who might be sitting around the leadership table one day. If there's work you want to do, if you want to dive in and be a better coach, be a better mentor, put in place some leadership development, don't necessarily look at all your mid-level leaders, put them all in a bucket and say, what do we need to do for all of them? Your mid-level leaders may be at way different levels of maturity and performance, and you're going to get your greatest ROI by starting by focusing on your best people. Partially because they could be great role models for everyone else. Partially because, like StrengthsFinder and positive psychology, the whole idea of spending more time leveraging your strengths than fixing your weaknesses is a really important idea. And it doesn't just work for you as an individual, it works for your team. Most leaders overinvest in their underperformers and underinvest in their high performers. Don't do that. Start with your high performers, start with your high potentials. What could you do to help them? Step 4, once you understand who those folks are, challenge them. Raise the bar. Set higher productivity goals. Set higher expectations around living the culture. Increase their responsibility, especially if you're stretched too thin. Give them projects to do. Don't think you need to take all of that on as a CEO or as a senior leader. Give your mid-level leaders projects to do, either as individuals or get a bunch of high potential mid-level leaders together and have them tackle a broken process or a new way to handle getting into a new market or developing a new project or figuring out a new strategy. So challenge them. And by the way, I've seen more superstars leave out of boredom than anything else. So challenge them to do more, be more, become more. So that's step 4. So far, set crystal clear expectations, model the way, start with your high performers, high potentials, challenge them is number 4. Number 5 is implement some training. Call it a leadership development program. But when I say that, I cringe a little bit because I've seen too many organizations spend months and months developing these all-encompassing leadership development programs, and they're crap and they don't work. They're either not done well or they're done well, but the time is not invested in making sure people are going through those programs and getting value out of it. Sometimes the senior leaders say, yeah, I know you've got to do this leadership development, but I need you to fix this problem first. They're putting every priority over leadership development. And the biggest problem I see is leadership development is about teaching a whole bunch of concepts. But what about actually holding people accountable for executing on it? So there's nothing wrong and everything right with saying, what do we need to do from a leadership development standpoint? Do we need to create a program? And how do we design that program? That's all good. But my suggestion is do it in small chunks. don't create an all-encompassing leadership development program. Start narrow. Not only what I said before, which is start with your high-performing folks and your high potentials, but start narrow. Don't try to teach everything. Maybe start with teaching people how to have the right kind of weekly one-on-one conversation with their direct reports. Maybe start by teaching people what coaching is all about versus managing, versus feedback, versus holding each other accountable. What does it mean to be a coach? What does it mean to ask the right questions to help people surface the right answer for them versus always giving advice? So when you do this leadership development program, think narrow and think not, did I check the box and teach people something? Think what value came out of that piece of leadership development. And as I said before, model the way. Part of modeling the way is, as a senior leader, you better make sure you're an expert in that first. That was step 5. Step 6 is, if you want to take care of your mid-level leaders, if you want your mid-level leaders to perform at a high level, you need to have the right hiring processes. Crappy hiring processes that cause the mid-level leaders to have a bunch of lower performing folks working for them. I don't care what leadership development program you put in place. I don't care what kind of coaching and development and mentorship you give them. They're going to find themselves diving down and having to do the job of their team members. So you need to put in place a hiring process that focuses on hiring the best. I love the top grading methodology. Now, it's not the only one. Have a methodology. And by the way, I hope Brad Smart isn't listening to this. Don't read the book Top Grading. I much prefer the book his son, Jeff Smart, wrote called Who, the A Method for Hiring. But you need to put in place a hiring process and commit to hiring the best people. That's step 6. Step 7, create transparent career pathways. Build career progressions to alleviate the uncertainty in people's minds about what's next. Mid-level leaders are going to be much more excited about doing what it takes to be great mid-level leaders if they see a career path in front of them. Now, for those of you who have companies that aren't growing very much, this is a tough thing to do, because you can create a career path on paper, but if your company's not growing, unless you retire or die, the folks working for you have no way up. So the most difficult part of having a career pathway is, man, you got to make sure you're firing on all cylinders and growing as a company, or that stuff looks good on paper, but it doesn't go anywhere. But create transparent career pathways and have discussions with your mid-level leaders as to where they want to go. When's the last time you sat down with them and said, where do you want to go in your career? And how could I help you get there? That's step 7, career pathways. And step 8 is be willing to coach low performing folks, whether they are low producing, which in my methodology means that productivity is low, or they're low culture fit. I don't care how productive they are. If you're not willing to coach those people out of the organization, you are tying the hands of your mid-level leaders. Not only are you setting a bad example for them, but again, you're forcing them to go down and do lower level work because you're not willing to coach the low performing folks out, including the low performing peers, not only allowing them to coach their low performers out, but if you've got someone who is a sales manager, but your operations manager and your service managers, those other mid-level leaders, aren't doing their job, it's hard for the sales manager to do their job. So be willing to model for them, having the difficult conversation, making the difficult decision, And sometimes the best way to take care of your best people is to fire your worst. So 8 steps I shared with you. They're not the only things, but I think they're pretty powerful if you start there. Step 1, setting crystal clear expectations. Step 2, starting. Step 2 is modeling the way. Step 3 is starting with your high performing, high potential folks. Step 4 is to challenge your mid-level leaders, raise the bar, increase responsibility. Step 5 is implement a leadership development program, but do it in manageable chunks with some real outcomes and value coming out of it. Step 6 is have hiring processes to hire the best. Step 7, create clear, transparent career pathways. Step 8, be willing to coach out your low performers. How equipped are your mid-level managers, your mid-level leaders to step into leadership roles tomorrow? You will benefit, your company will benefit by making sure they are equipped. Start thinking what would it take for them to do the next job? What would it take for them to sit around the leadership table? And a great way to start is start with creating those crystal clear expectations for them. And make sure you're having weekly one-on-ones, productive weekly one-on-ones with them to help them understand how they're doing against those expectations, to hold them accountable for that, and to coach them. If you want a great leadership team, you need a great set of mid-level leaders. And if you want a great company, you need a great leadership team. So it all falls into line. I hope that helped. I'll see you next time.